Carlos, I always appreciate our opportunities to connect. I think very highly of you and really enjoyed our time working together. Glad we've stayed in touch. And today, we were talking a little bit about just high performers. High performance really is, more or less a process. How can you make it repeatable? And I think you've got some philosophies around that, so I'd love to talk about that today. What are your thoughts around how you can make high performance a repeatable thing?
Yeah, that's I think that's the $1 billion question, Carson. So I tell you from my standpoint, one thing that really resonated and was drilled into my mind from an early stage mentor was amazing people don't do different things. They do things differently. And that to me really, really resonated. And I just started observing and looking at the people that I admired. And that included like when I saw you prospecting, when I saw you generating net new revenue, net new pipeline, net new deals, net new connections. I'm always studying what amazing, excellent people are doing. And I sort of distilled it into what I call the VIP framework. And so the V for value, the I for impact, and P for positivity. And so I'll talk a little bit about those, but ultimately, this sort of became my core philosophy. And then from a leadership standpoint, it became my core expectation for anybody that's in my team. And so when I think about value, I think of value in terms of every interaction. If you think of the best people, the exceptional people, every time you have an interaction, they're prepared. They're bringing value to the table. In sales, that could be thought leadership, that could be investments, that could be discounting programs, it could be a number of things, but you're bringing a point of view and you're valuable from the get-go. So for me, it all starts with being valuable. Think of, I always talk about this stat, there's 550,000 software companies in the US. So a CIO, CTO in a Fortune 500 company is probably getting prospected by 25 to 5,000 different software companies. That, if you think of that stat, it's just unbelievable. So how are you valuable enough to warrant that CIOs, CTOs, or whatever your business decision maker is mindset? So it starts with value. But then if you're adding value and you're not generating results, you're not impacting the business, that's sort of useless, right? So for me, the second thing is impact. You're able to align your superpower, what you do really, really, really well, what is your unique value that you're bringing to the table, the things that you do better than anybody else in the world, and you align that with business impact, and that creates results. That may be quota attainment, that would be transformational business outcomes for your customers, but it's driving real impact to the business. And then finally, to the point of how you do things, it's positivity. You could be the MVP of the league, but if nobody wants to be around you, if when you show up, people just cringe, that's a real problem, right? I always tell people 85% of humanity is already dead. We're in the top 15%. And then we live in the US, we have 4 limbs, it's all cherry on top, right? So for me, positivity is what really brings it all around, and we're bringing that energy into the room. So when I think about high performance, to answer that question, I go back to this VIP framework and how am I showing up in every interaction and how am I expecting my people to show up in every interaction? And I look at it through the lens of value, impact, and positivity.
That's magical. I mean, that it truly is. And I would even say too, like, my mind while you were talking was thinking about some other opportunities around like, what else could I and P even stand for? Like influence, personality, but value doesn't go anywhere because value is at the heart of everything. We've got to have, with every relationship we have, I've got a couple of philosophies around sales food chains. So, people that we touch both internally, colleagues, team members, partners, then also outside when we're working directly with some of our clients, we've got to make sure we're adding value into all those relationships and proactively adding value, because you're not going to get anything unless you're giving, and you're not guaranteed to receive. You've got to give in good faith and really invest in these relationships. And I believe that if you selflessly invest and add value in all the relationships that you touch, you're going to yield plenty. And I'm a firm believer that rather than being so transfixed on results, be transfixed on adding value in relationships, and the results will come. Same thing with impact. I would say the I can double as influence as well, because you've got to think about, if you're thinking about how you're going to impact something, yes, you want to bring impact, and you want to be sure that it's unique. I loved that you highlighted how much some of these people get prospected. And I think where we fail as sellers sometimes is not recognizing that 100 other people may have reached out to the exact same person. And if we do the same thing that those other folks are doing, we're going to be treated the same way. So what are you going to do to stand out? You know, do you maybe send them video? Do you maybe send them LinkedIn voicemail? Do you maybe send them a personalized card or some kind of gift, or just, or do you send a different type of message that shows that you actually understand or did a little bit of research about what kind of boat they're in, that you understand their company and their company initiatives and their priorities? Or do you just send the same old thing of, these are all the things that my company can do for you, let's talk? And you know, I think that's where that's very much at the heart of what you just said. We've got to be adding impact, but we've got to think about influence. And you're not going to influence change unless you really understand where the other person is coming from. Now, granted, as you start to have conversations, that is a key element of getting to know them better. But you've got to come from a better footing of, you know, I've done a little bit of research. I know kind of what you're grappling with, and I know some of the challenges in your industry. How are you tackling this? And I'd love to really talk more about how you're broaching this, because this is what I do. I reach out to and I talk to many different people in your shoes, and I understand where you're coming from because of X, Y, Z. And then lastly, P, you highlighted positivity, and you're so right. You've got to have positive energy. You've got to bring energy to the table, period. But I think a part of that's personality, because if I look at high performers, you can have a lot of different personality types, but the key is that you've got to really be able to bring that personality to the table where you're humble, you're eager to learn, you have a growth mindset, you look at things from an optimistic lens, and you're willing to pivot. And so positivity in the light of all of that is so critical. But at the same time, you've got to have the right personality to be able to navigate through those waters. You've got to have a unique approach, and to make it repeatable, because that's what, you know, that's what we're really trying to have at the heart of. It's all about consistency. If you're consistent with the VIP approach, you'll have consistent results, period. I'm a firm believer that if you got the right people following the right process, you'll be successful, but you have to be consistent in execution. And I think that actually kind of brings me to my next question for you, is around just that selling element. You know, we talk a lot about the close, right? The art of the close, how you can get a deal to come to closure. And I think you and I have similar philosophies on that. So I'm interested in your take on closing the deal, you know, how to maybe close more deals, shore up sales cycles, but to really build some of those genuine relationships with clients. What are your thoughts on closing the deal?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And by the way, I love how you redefined the VIP framework. You did it better than I do, so that's fantastic. And that's great.
No, man, it's your framework. It's your framework. I've got to adopt it now and make it partly my own. And you know, it's funny that you say that, because I think that's what high performers have to do. We have to find what we like about what other people are doing, and then we adopt that into our arsenal. And that's what makes us better. The things that I'm doing, we're not reinventing wheels. We're taking what's the best part of others, and we're applying that framework in our own lives. I love it.
It's fantastic. So to the question of closing, man, I always give the analogy. For me, closing, when I use the word closing, the first thing that you think about is awkward conversation, where I'm potentially envisioning a proposal or a presentation with a long pause, where I'm sort of psychologically trying to get into my prospect's head and trying to figure out what they're trying to think. And I think that's just the wrong way to think about it, right? When I think about closing, I always use the analogy of an ATM. If I go to an ATM, if I'm going to be able to get money out of it or not, does not depend on what I'm doing at that moment. I could be dressed very, very well or not dressed well at all. If I've been doing the right thing for the last 10 years or 15 years or 5 years, it's going to give me money. My bank account is going to be healthy. If I'm not, it doesn't matter what I do right now. I'm not going to get money from that ATM. And I think of the closing moment as the same thing. There's two things from the standpoint of closing that were really game changer realizations for me. One, you're closing from the first moment that you ask your customer, Mr. Customer or Miss Customer, was this 60 minutes of your time, was this meeting valuable to you? Okay. And I ask that in every single question or every single meeting that I've got with a customer. I always ask, and I do this with my team as well, right? I always ask, has this been a valuable use of your time? Okay. If you get enough of those micro confirmations, I am 100% sure that you're eventually going to close the deal. So that was one thing. It's just understanding that closing is not a moment. Closing is the cumulative or many, many, many micro confirmations and micro affirmations. The second thing is closing in the context of jointly coming up with a solution that works for your customer. That's another thing that to me was just a game changer paradigm, right? I used to think of proposals as I come up with a proposal, I present it to you, customer, and you, customer, give you your feedback. And I don't know, 5-10 years ago, a manager and a big mentor told me, look, on day one or day two, just show them what your ideas are and say, hey, this is sort of what I'm thinking, prospect, but I really just want to craft a deal that makes sense for both of us. And you help me understand what a winning value proposition looks like. And they'll coach you to what the deal looks like. The moment that I just embraced that mentality and closed and got micro affirmations and asked the question every single meeting, and when it came to the moment of drafting the actual deal and closing the agreement or closing the deal, and I just developed it with the team within that customer account, it just became much, much easier for me. So those are sort of my two principles when it comes to closing. I don't think of closing as an event of an interaction. I think of closing as a process and a set of principles that help you be successful.
Every salesperson in this world needs to hear what you just said. And here's why. So I started in a very transactional environment. It was a one-call close. You get somebody on the phone, you better close them right then and there because you'll probably never talk to them again. And fast forward, I've spent a lot of the last several years of my career in more of an enterprise environment with very long sales cycles in some cases. When you're asking somebody to overhaul a pretty intense part of their business, you're obviously not going to get that accomplished in an afternoon. So I think it's important that people understand that, look, no matter what environment you're in, there's a sales process, and rightfully so. But I think where we've got to understand is that the process doesn't work without the right people. And that's on all sides. From our vantage point, we have to bring people along with us on the journey. You may have a grand vision. You may think a sales play is perfect for a client, but there's the personal element. You have to make sure to get their buy-in, their trust. They have to respect your perspective. And so I think you're spot on, because there's no such thing about closing a sale if you haven't set the foundation for the relationship. I believe that the closure of a sale comes as a natural byproduct of a relationship of two groups or organizations that want to work together, period. And you've got to build a lot of trust to get there. Now, in a one-call close transactional type thing, that may take a quicker amount of time to get them to make a decision in some cases if it's something that is of less consequence or risk. Talking about their internet package or their TV package or some type of advertising program. But on the flip side of that, you're talking to them about something about transforming their entire business, how they collect and leverage data, talking to them about how they engage with their customers. These things are very personal, and as well they should be. So the other thing is, because there is so much risk at stake, that's why it's so important to make sure that trust factor exists. You want to make sure that you minimize the risk. You want to make sure that they see it as less of a gamble of current process, because that's what they look at. And that's where what I think is missing from the closing process for most sellers is we don't look at that human element. We don't truly understand, what is a win for that person. So I'd challenge you to go to, if you're having a blocker with a relationship. I had a situation years ago where I could tell that this C-level person and I didn't necessarily see eye to eye. I think they had a track record that they bragged about of not really liking vendors and salespeople, and I fit into both buckets at the time. So, but I knew that, right? I knew that going in. So I kept telling him, I was like, let's figure out, I want to make your team win. That's all I care about. And so here are resources that I can bring to bear. These are the types of conversations that we need to be having. I brought in some very valuable people that he still works with to this day. And even though I didn't need to be the hero, that wasn't the important thing. I wanted the customer to be the hero. And if you focus on the customer being the hero, deals can come to closure. That deal happened, but it didn't happen because they liked me or they liked my company. It was because I was able to figure out what looked like a win to him, break down barriers that existed, and make sure that he was coming along for the ride with me. Because believe me, that organization had actually looked for every way that they could go about doing this without enlisting our help. How could they do it themselves? Could they leverage a different vendor? But we won the deal because it was something that we were there. We knew that they weren't going to just walk willingly with us. We weren't going to necessarily be able to guide them to the water to drink, but because we swarmed them with value and resources and influence and made sure that we found a win for them, that's why we won. So I couldn't agree more. And Carlos, you hit on something really interesting there as well too. Sales cycles. Sales cycles differ so much by industry or solution area. And I think that's an area where a lot of sellers have a hard time, because not only do you have to adapt to what the sales cycle may look like, but you also have to answer to it. You're going to be asked about pipeline. You're going to be asked about when is this going to come to closure? And it's painful when you have to move something by a quarter or more. And in a pandemic and in a world of sometimes some uncertainty, it's more common to have to change the sales cycles. There's been a lot of impact. So I'm curious as to your philosophy to sales cycles in general. I know that you have some ways that you kind of distill the sales cycle, and I'd love to hear about that. But also, how have you successfully pivoted to a lot of the changes in sales cycles that we've experienced over the last year?
Yeah, so this is a fantastic question. And here's what I will tell you, Carson. My answer is going to be unconventional. I think when you hear this answer, your first reflection is going to be, hey, I don't know if this is worthy of sharing, right? But I will tell you, Carson, my philosophy is, I think when we talk about salespeople's ability to qualify a deal or qualify an opportunity, we're thinking about it completely the wrong way. I would actually flip the table or flip the coin and say, why are you not having your customers qualify themselves? Okay. And the way that I think about this is, I think of the sales process ultimately from the most fundamental, most rudimentary standpoint. I think of two buckets. You're either selling or you're building. Okay. Or in other words, you're either educating or you're executing. And if you really think about those in terms of first principles, that applies from the moment that your champion within the customer account is selling their leadership on your solution or your business outcomes or your specific value proposition, to the point where you're selling them on your differentiation as a technology vendor or as a vendor or as a strategic partner versus others, okay? To the point that they start flipping into, okay, we know the why, we're bought into doing this, and we're trying to figure out how. Okay, but ultimately, Carson, my big principle there is, we as humans always, if we see two buckets or we see two options, we immediately want to gravitate to one. It's psychology 101, right? If I see two buckets, I want to gravitate to one. So what I started doing very early in my career was, if I have a customer that says, hey, I am thinking of doing this with my data center, or I am planning to buy, to your point, I am evaluating a new vehicle or a new TV package. My question to them is always, awesome, I love, thank you for the opportunity of reaching out and helping us help you through this, just so that I can calibrate myself on your level of urgency, timelines, and readiness. Can you help me understand, are you in the education stage? Are you in the execution stage? Are you trying to build the case as to why things need to change? Or are you trying to figure out, how can I do this in a way that I minimize risk? And the customers will immediately tell you, and more than one time I've gotten the feedback of, hey, this is a great question. I'm happy you're forcing me to think through it that way. The truth is, I'm still thinking through it. I'm trying to convince my leadership. I'm trying to make the case as to why things should change. And I'm trying to quantify the benefit of that change. And that immediately, as a salesperson, helps you understand, okay, this may be a great future deal, but there's a lot of work that needs to happen for me to make that deal real, for me to close that deal, for me to really get that into the book. So for me, the foundational thought here, Carson, is two things. One, thinking of the sales stage as just a couple of buckets, however you want to look at them, building the why, building the how, selling and building, it's education, execution. Okay, so it's really bucketizing those two. And then having your customer tell you where they're at. The moment you do that, you're in tune, you remove friction, you're calibrated, you understand where you're at in the process. And to your point, you can even do a better job of representing your business, your pipeline, your opportunities, not only to your customers and yourself, but even from a business leadership standpoint. So I would say from a sales process standpoint, Carson, that understanding and sort of thought process was super valuable for me.
I'm going to need to play this clip for myself every morning before I go out and try to have sales conversations. So, Carlos, it's just so many different possibilities there. I loved how you framed up the way that you can have that conversation, how you ask those questions to really frame that up with a customer, because you've got to make sure you're on the same page. It's so critical for us. And I want to stay on sales cycles because this is a great topic. It's so critical for us as sellers to make sure that we're on the same page with clients, but that we're mapping out that roadmap and what those milestones look like together. But if you're in a different mode than they are, it's not going to click. And so understanding where they're coming from and truly, again, you know, we just talked about this as far as ensuring that the client is getting a win out of this. That's all at the heart of this. I've got to understand their budget. I've got to understand their timeline. And frankly, the viability of them moving forward in a meaningful fashion. What kind of resources are they going to need? So, you know, there's an element of this where in a sales process, you never want to think too far ahead. I mean, it's kind of like in sports. You don't want to look to next week's game when you've got to play this week's. But you also have to be cognizant of what does a post-sales relationship look like? Because I think that's another area where we can fall flat as sellers if we don't give it enough thought. There's got to be a great post-sales type of engagement, because how often as a seller do you hear where something was sold and then they never heard from the organization or the seller or any of those folks again? So we've got to make sure that we set the right foundation, not only for this moment, but the process itself, and then the post-sales piece, because it's all about gaining buy-in and gaining consensus and building momentum around these milestones. Because from here, it's accountability piece. You know, we want to jointly establish what these milestones look like, and we want to make sure we hold each other accountable to those milestones, whether it's, you know, putting stuff out on the calendar now to say, hey, we want to have a touch point every X number of weeks. We need to have these players at the table. We need to bring these resources in. We need to sit down and talk a little bit about some of the things that are going to be critical to making this a mutual win. And I think if you do that, you can be very successful. Now, my question to you here is, so still staying on sales cycles. Now you've done a little bit of, you know, really discerning the different modes that people can be in from a sales cycle perspective, but how do you, specifically when you need to shorten up a sales cycle, you know, there's all kinds of pressures, right? You know, we realize sometimes that if we don't get things done in a certain amount of time, I mean, a window may pass. You know, there's competitive forces. We're always under pressure to shore up sales cycles, but we also have to move at the speed of a customer. So how do you apply that lens that you just outlined very articulately, by the way? How do you apply that lens when you're trying to level set, when you're trying to shore up what a sales cycle actually turns out to be?
Yeah, so that's a fantastic question, Carson. And I always start with the end in mind, right? I always try to anchor on, hey, customer, you're trying to do this because of, why are you trying to do this? You're trying to do this because you've got a deadline of being compliant with this regulation by January 23 or by whatever the date may be. So I always start with, at the end of the day, customer, what commitments have you made to your customers, okay, in a B2B scenario? What commitments have you made to your customers, to your leadership, that are driving ultimately this deadline, okay? And so I start with that end in mind, because then we work from that all the way back, okay? And at that point, I would say, Carson, for me, it goes back to, I always say in this new digital economy where you have to be a top-notch seller, extremely valuable resource for you to earn a CTO, CIO's time, You have to be half setter, but half project manager. You have to have the ability for you to get in the door. You have to have the ability for you to frame up next steps, but you also have to have the ability to put a timeline together and say, customer, for you to hit this deadline by January 2023, which is the only thing that matters to you, regardless of anything that I say, here's what we need to be doing today. And I always frame it as those are our two timeline anchor points. The time that you need to hit a specific milestone and the date that is today. And in between, here's the specific milestones that I need to accomplish. So I would say, Carson, in this regard, I don't have a silver bullet. I would just say, in my mind, the expectation for us as sales leaders has completely shifted. It was okay before to just be a great salesman and a great closer. Now you have to be part project milestone, project manager. You have to be project, you have to be able to maintain a schedule and sort of drive discipline and accountability to your prospect and manage them to that timeline. And by the way, they will love that because we as human beings crave certainty. We crave understanding exactly what the next step is going to be. The moment that we take the initiative, even better if it's unsolicited, to lay out those milestones and timelines for them, it's the time that we both add value and gain 100% control of what the timelines would look like. And are there going to be slips and delays and things that we unexpected? Absolutely, but we're at least working towards target. So that would be my thought on that, Carson, if that's helpful at all.
It is completely. And I think it comes around that building trust, right? Because if you have a good relationship with a client and things slip on either side, it's something that can be worked through. But if you don't, that's where the trust starts to falter. And don't get me wrong, I mean, you can't just have things slip on a regular basis. But I think if you're transparent about the process and why, and you make it about them, and also you leverage the agreed upon timelines in a respectful way of why you're proceeding the way you are, then it makes it a lot more cohesive relationship. So what I mean by that is, first off, transparency of process. Make it about them. When I explain a process, like what the deal process looks like from our vantage point, the timelines that matter to us, I think it's imperative to point out, like, it's going to take X amount of time for us to put together this deal structure. This is what the structure I envision it may look like hypothetically. But you also have to make sure that you're very careful in how you preface all of these things, because you can't make promises. You can't necessarily throw out a lot of tangible items right out of the chute, but you definitely want to make sure that they understand how long it's going to take to put together a meaningful deal. If there's resources that you can bring to bear, what that looks like. If there's ways that you want to invest, what the timeline is for even processing an order, and when it's got to be done. But make it about them. And what I mean by that is when you can express to them that the more time I have in order to understand when this thing's going to come to closure, the more time I can spend in making sure that I go in front of the right people, because I'm the evangelist for your brand at my organization. The more people I can go in front of and make sure to advocate for you and to figure out where we can invest and exactly how we can make sure that this is a win for your organization, the better. So we know that you've got to go in front of the board in this month on this day. Mm-hmm. And we know that I need to have at least a week or two lead time. We know that legal's got to review this. We know, so understand all those parameters and set those hard deadlines, but make those deadlines about them. And that actually leads me to my next point, is that when you're reaching out.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
No, I was going to say before the next question, I do have a comment on that, because I thought you touched on something that we have to look at 10 times. So go ahead.
Yeah, and this is actually brief, because that ties into my other point. Is I think a lot of times as sellers, we send these notes like, hey, I'm following up, or just want to touch base, and we just want to see where this is. No. The way you want to reach out is, Mr. and Mrs. Customer, I want to ensure that I'm being respectful of your expressed timelines, or the timelines that we agreed upon. And in order to ensure that we're on track, where does this stand? What do we need to do? Do we need to get back together? Make a very concise, crisp recommendation of the next step, but do it because of timelines that you established, not because you're following up or touching base. Go ahead. Love to hear your thoughts.
I was going to say, I just what you just said, this might be the core of sales 101 and what it really takes to be successful. It's really going back to how do I anchor everything on what the customer cares about.
Yep.
Everything else is irrelevant. And then you said something that I think there's such a hidden gem on it, Carson, around transparency of process. I would take that one step farther and say transparency of intention. If you think of your best and worst vehicle buying experience ever, okay, and I think to the best one that I've ever had, it's I vividly remember I was trying to buy a car that I absolutely loved, and it was on a price that was way cheaper than I was expecting. This was not the price that I was expecting to pay for this car. And the guy, he specifically told me, he's like, hey, when you look at that price, the first thing you're going to think about is what's in it for us. Why are we selling this cheap? People hate the color. If you like the color, there's nothing to worry about. If you don't, that's going to be a problem. I think, Carson, of every time we go to a customer with an insane discount or an offer or an investment, why don't we articulate and say, hey, here's the reason why this makes sense to me as a seller and to me as a company. I'd love to help you take advantage of it. This is why it's valuable for both. And believe it or not, as human beings, we just immediately sort of take a step back and understand that there's no catch. We already know what the catch is. And if we're okay with it, we get to a win-win. So I just wanted to share that because I thought what you just shared, Carson, was incredibly valuable.
Everything that we do as sellers needs to be centered around the customer. I mean, I've got a philosophy I call the Sales Trinity. It's the customer, the company, and you. And all three have to win in every deal. But you're going to go farthest if you make everything about the customer. Why you're pressing these timelines, the value that they get out of that, what the deal structure looks like. How is this going to be constructed and how you can make it benefit the customer. And if you do that, it's a lot more likely that they're going to come along for the ride. Next question that I wanted to hit on is, this is very timely because, I think a lot of people right now are assessing their career. Okay. Some people because they have to. And I think our hearts go out to a lot of the folks that have been negatively impacted of the events of the last year. But I think a lot of people are really assessing career. And sometimes in that process, we are hip to look to, different types of industries. I know you've had a very interesting trajectory. As have I. I've been in a lot of different industry verticals that if you put them all on paper, they don't make any sense. So I'm curious as to your thoughts on just career development in general. What's the missing element? Because you can go out right now and, sure, you could get a career coach. You could, look up articles on career advice and things like that. But I'm curious as to what are the types of things that have really been impactful for you personally in your career journey? And what would you tell somebody right now that's maybe looking at different career choices, maybe different industries, or just looking to make a change in general?
Yeah, that's a great question. And to your point, Carson, I know many people are doing this right now just for the sake of development, or others because they have to. I would say two things that are critical for me, Carson, that really just changed my approach on anything. And just for everybody that's listening to have a frame of reference as to what my trajectory has been, I graduated. I'm an electrical engineer by training. So I started literally as an electrical engineer doing engineering work. I then took on more customer support, sales types of role, working for an industrial manufacturing company called Cummins, selling really to big mining enterprises, big oil and gas enterprises, big power generation enterprises. I did that for about 3 or 4 years, but I always loved technology as part of my job, okay? And so I started doing within my job, just finding excuses for me to leverage technology to make myself better at my job. That ultimately morphed into an offer for me to do the technology piece 100% of the time, okay? And that eventually led to a job at a startup that brought me into the Microsoft ecosystem. And that ultimately led me to my role today, which is at Microsoft, leading a team of sellers selling into the East US. So all that to say, I've gone from technical to technical leadership, to sales and project management, to leading a startup, to now leadership and sales, both at Microsoft and the corporate and enterprise world. My point, Carson, have been my two critical insights have been: one, the moment for you to do the next job you want to get is today. And what I mean by that is, let's say that I am a salesperson, okay? but I'm really passionate about today I sell vehicles or today I sell kitchens, okay? But I'm really passionate about selling technology. The moment for you to learn and sell technology is not when you get the technology sales job. It's today. What can you do within your vehicle sales or auto sales or kitchen sales job that's going to allow you to sell technology within it and become the best trusted technology seller that you can possibly get? And that for me was a huge thing. And I'll give you a quick story, right? The reason that I got into technology is when I was in the field selling and supporting mining companies, oil and gas companies, I was just married and traveling 3 weeks and a half a month, okay? Just spending 100% of time in the field. And a lot of it was so that I could understand the engines and equipment that I was supporting, that I could understand and diagnose if they were failing or not failing and why they were failing. And eventually we found that there was a way for us to do that remotely. So for personal reasons, I'm like, I gotta master this technology, because if I do that, I don't have to travel anymore. And I started leveraging what we now call IoT or telematics or telemetry to get information from that equipment in the field and leverage that data to prevent those failures. So all that to say, Carson, I did the technology job 2 years earlier than my first technology job. And I think that's the first paradigm shift. If you're waiting for the job that you want to start doing that role, you're already too late. What can you do today, even if it's as a stretch project, even if it's getting with people within the organization who are driving to that? What can you do today to do the job that you want to have? That's one. And then the second thing is, I would say, just changing the lens of networking. We tend to think of networking as, let me go to a happy hour and have an uncomfortable conversation with a bunch of people about things that neither they or I care about, right? And that to me is by no means what networking is. And I think, Carson, you and I may actually be a great example of this, right? I don't know if you even remember this, but when we met each other, we actually overlapped for about a month, and we've known each other for 4 years. But the reason, but why we do that is we always find ways to add value to each other, okay? And so that what, to me, networking is about every single time, is identifying somebody that you admire, that you like, that you want to model, understanding what they care about, and understanding what can I do in my role today that's both valuable to you and valuable to me, because it helps me solidify relationships and it helps me build the skills that I want to get. So for me, when I think about career and industry change, if you change your paradigm and your lens on those two things, one, doing the job you want to have today, finding opportunities to do it before you ever apply for it, okay, that's one. And two, changing our perspective on networking from a happy hour to more of a, how do I identify the win-wins and opportunities to add value to the people that I model and I would love to work with.
It's powerful. And I've got a ton of thoughts around that. If I were to talk to my 20-something-year-old self, I think the advice that basically echoes what you just said that would have mattered most to me would be, first off, that it is all about relationships. Your path is not going to be or look like what you think it will. You know, I thought I was down a certain path. I was, getting promoted, and I was always looking at, okay, what's the next role? What's the next role? I want to master this and then move to my next role. That doesn't work like that. I thought I'd spend my entire career at one organization. That didn't happen either. And so I think the key is being open to where the journey is going to take you, but really double down on your passions and your brand and relationships. You got to know yourself. You got to know what your strengths are. You got to know what your passions are. You got to know what you care about, and you got to infuse that into what you do. But every job that I've been pulled into in my life has been because of relationships that I had, people pulling me into different types of roles, or relationships that I had that mattered when it came to getting the job. I mean, that's just the nature of that game. Sure, there's anomalies. I got one job years ago from a job board. Okay, but the rest of them have been because I knew somebody or because my brand was strong enough that I got brought into a situation. So to your point, be right now what you want to be. Start doing some of those things that you want your name to be linked to and that you want to be synonymous with. Create your own next job with what you're doing. I think that's a big miss that a lot of people, fail to do. They fail to realize that you're interviewing for your next job right now with the people that you interact with, the value that you bring. The other part of that, and this exemplifies what you just said about like our relationship. Yeah, we worked together technically on paper for a very, very brief amount of time. But then I asked you, because of some of the work that we were doing, like, hey, let's maybe do a couple of projects together to mutually benefit us. Say yes to opportunities, even if they don't necessarily make sense. And you know what? Sometimes I'm probably bad about that because I get asked to do stuff all the time and I always say yes. And it's probably to my detriment because a lot of this stuff, it can take time, but you never know the value that's going to come to you when you say yes to an opportunity and you get involved with other groups of people. I've had people in different divisions of the business that have asked me like, hey, will you do this or that? Will you create a training module for this or that? Stuff that's not even really directly related to my own role. But I say yes every single time because you never know where these relationships will go, will evolve. I mean, you and I are sitting here right now having a conversation. We've known each other 4 years, but we worked together for a very brief amount of time as part of the same team. But yet I'm learning a ton during this conversation. And, I think if people challenge the norms, you hit on something that we've all been there at those networking events where you stand around, you hold your drink, and you're looking at your watch. How long do I have to sit here before I can make a respectful exit? And then you fumble around for conversations, you exchange a business card, and then you never talk to those people again. Look for ways that you can add value in every single relationship you come across. And again, same philosophies apply with colleagues that it does with customers. It's about looking for ways to help them win. It's about looking for ways to add value for them and figuring out what they care about and how you might be able to do something for them, introduce them to somebody or introduce a concept or just anything that you might be able to do for somebody else. That's how meaningful relationships are formed. And I think that actually is a perfect segue into the other question that I wanted to ask you today. And that is really more about being really just, okay, so networking in general, you hit on a lot of things about it in the last discussion point, you hit on some things about networking in general. And there's no value at all in bland or generic or forced interaction. But that said, we've established the importance both in client relationships and also colleague relationships of meaningful networking. So I'm curious with you, because there's a lot of focus now on, and rightfully so, on empathy and bringing your authentic self into the workplace. So I'm curious from your vantage point, everything's virtual now for the most part, we're in a pandemic, and even from here, we're going to have hybrid work, right? There's going to be a lot more virtual presence to what we do, which I think there's a lot of great things to that, but I'm curious to your thoughts. Practical networking, how do we create meaningful connections in this day and age?
So that's an awesome question. I think it's a great way for us to look back to the start, right? The VIP framework. Here's what I would tell you, man. I always think of sales as sales is confidence, and confidence is self-awareness, okay? And if you really digest that, for me, self-awareness is understanding, Carson, what can you do that nobody else in the world can do? And you have one thing, and I have one thing, and I think there's no right answer, but there has to be an answer. If you don't know what you can do better than anybody else in the world, that's a problem. So when I think about bringing your authentic self, about networking in a virtual world, I think, Carson, it understands with a deep, fundamental understanding and assessment, and asking you particularly if you're humble and you value humility, asking yourself, looking at the mirror, what are you the best in the world at, is a very uncomfortable question. But it is where confidence breathes. It is where confidence is birthed. And I am very confident that that's where sales success can come from. So I would say that's how you understand your authentic self, Carson. It's really understanding what I'm great at, what I'm not great at, and then shaping your connections and relationships around that. If there's something that you really value, that you're really strong at, who within my network today could that asset or skill be valuable to? Okay. If I know that I have something to say and Carson has a podcast, or I know that this person needs something, let me offer some help and say, here's an opportunity for you to win, for me to win, and just strengthen the relationship that we've got. And on the other side, if I really understand what I'm weak on, what I could be better on, how can I go to people? People love to help. When we ask people for help, people actually love that. They love to help others, right? We as humans being want to be the saviors. We want to be the people that bring value to others. So how can we go to other people and say, hey, Carson, I love what you do from a prospecting standpoint. Can you help me understand this? That's what I think the key is here. Carson, to your point, in a virtual world, there's no organic scenario where we're just going to be in the same hallway or in the same desk or in the same physical location. We have to go the extra mile. We have to do the effort. And how I would argue we can do that is start with self-awareness, understand where you can add value, understand what others can add value, and be courageous. Reach out, identify win-win opportunities, and that inadvertently creates a network that's going to be fun, valuable, fulfilling, and just help you be better at what you do.
God, it's brilliant. And I've got a lot of thoughts about that, because if you look at the common themes here, you know, you had an interesting career trajectory. You came into one line of work and you kind of followed some not necessarily connected dots to get into a leadership role at a very prominent organization. And it's all about understanding your superpower, but also understanding the superpowers and priorities of other people. And I think you create opportunities by plugging into that and being at the pulse of what's going on. You know, I'm a small town guy who worked in the grocery business as a bagger and then a meat clerk. And I had a relationship that got me hired in a role that I thought was going to be a service job, wound up being sales. And I was good at it because of the way that I looked to, how can I fix the problem? I'm a problem solver. I look at what's wrong and I try to fix it as quickly as I can. And so customers calling in and I was looking to solve problems, but very much trying to figure out, okay, how can I leverage all the parameters that are in place here in order to create a better scenario? And I think that's the approach that we have to look at. How can I make things, like you said, how can I make things better for other people? You know, when I had years ago managers that would take other roles, there'd be a vacancy, offer to step up. I got promoted years ago to a manager, to a senior manager, and to a director role solely because of the fact that when there were responsibilities that needed to be taken on, when there was a vacancy, I offered to do everything. And then I just ended up assuming the position. But it's the value that you know that you can add in those situations and the willingness to do the work. You create your own opportunities by seeing a need and actually going out and trying to fill that need genuinely and with passion, with desire, but offering to help, asking and offering to help. Help is required everywhere. There's always people that, you know, that need help, but you've got to be able to also be vulnerable and open to understanding, you know, where you can best fit. And it's never going to be a perfect fit, right? I mean, nothing is ever, you know, you're going to come into roles sometimes that, you know, you align to certain elements of it and then other elements you don't. Same thing with people that you come into contact with. It's not always going to be an exact match. People are not going to behave exactly the way that you think they will. But if you understand their priorities and their motivating factors, you can go a long way in order to forge some genuine relationships. And again, that's what it's all about, is relationships and really looking at how you can add value to them, but how you can remove blockers to their success. If you identify that something is, you know, that they need something and that you can add value right then and there, invest in that relationship because you never know where it's going to go. You know, I think it's critical to point out, especially because we're talking about forging genuine relationships right now. There are no geographical boundaries. There's no commute. There's no travel. And sure, you know, our days are very busy, but it takes seconds to just reach out to somebody, tell them they're doing a great job, ask for a one-to-one meeting, ask for a call, give them a call. You can pop on a video chat. I've talked to friends, family, and colleagues all over the world over the last year some that I hadn't even talked to that much prior to the pandemic. So take that situation, and no matter what, there are ways that if you truly care about where other people are coming from, you understand their superpower, but you also understand how your superpower can help them. There's ways that you can invest in relationships right now that have such meaning, such value, and those investments will pay off with great relationships into the future.
I love that, man. Couldn't have said it better myself. Every time I talk to you, new ideas, fresh perspective, just super energized, man. So thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. This was a ton of fun.
Thank you. I had a blast, man. I'm gonna turn off the recording and then